Hi, Bob Cabana, KSC Center Director here, and I've got a couple of very special guests with me as we look back on Apollo 13 in the year of its 50th anniversary. With me today are Apollo 13 lunar module command pilot Fred Hayes and Apollo 16 lunar module command pilot Charlie Duke. Now, I think everybody knows where you were, Fred, for Apollo 13. But Charlie, I got to ask you, where were you during Apollo 13?
Well, I was backup crew for Fred, and I had had caught the measles about a couple of weeks before the flight, and fouled up everything with Mattingly getting taken off the crew, and Jack Swigert, who I'd trained with, took his place. Anyway, when the accident came, I went down to mission control with John Young, our commander, or backup commander, TK, and we spent 35 hours trying to get these guys back safely.
Awesome. Fredo, so I think there's two phrases from the Apollo program that really stand out to the American public. Of course, Neil's words when he stepped down on the surface of the moon on Apollo 11, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And I think the other one is Houston, we've got a problem. What what happened? Where were you when Jim Lovell made that call? What were your thoughts going on right then?
Well, I actually did not hear the call. I was down in the landing craft putting away things we had taken out for a TV show that we had just finished. And so I wasn't on the radio, so I didn't hear what was going on. But I knew something was seriously wrong from the degree of the loud bang reverberating through the metal hull, and some of the vehicle motion felt with jets firing, attitude jets firing, trying to, I guess, hold attitude. So I knew this was this was not normal. But as yet, I did not realize exactly what the problem was or how serious it was.
Well, once you guys realized, the problem, how did you feel? How did you deal with that stress? I mean, what prepared you to handle that crisis?
Well, I think it was a training. What I felt though, when I got back to the right couch position and scanned the instrument panel, from the readings in a couple of meters, it was obvious we had lost oxygen tank 2. And I was really just sick of my stomach because I knew without looking any further at mission rules, reference in mission rules, that was an abort. We would have to come home as soon as possible. And so I had all that training, getting ready for the mission, as well as 2 other missions, 8 and 11 I trained for. And my big chance to land on the moon was gone in a flash. So I was just sick to my stomach there. It still did not seem as serious as it was, because it appeared oxygen tank 1 was intact. And it took some time for that slow leak to develop and make it obvious we're going to lose all our oxygen, 2 tanks, and lose the fuel cells.
So, Charlie, this could have been one of NASA's absolute worst moments, and it turned into be one of our best. Looking back on it, what was the mood like in mission control? How was the team down on Earth dealing with this? What were their thoughts?
Well, after the accident, I think within a half hour, John had called me and he said, "Come on in. They got a real serious problem, and they've lost an oxygen tank." So we went in, TK and myself and John and probably some of the other crew guys, like I remember Cernan, and we just pitched in to see what we could do. And I know that they were not on a free return trajectory. So the first item was to decide whether we're going to burn and bring them right back, be a U-turn, but it was obvious that it was to go around the moon was the was the best, but we had to get them on a free return trajectory. So John and I got over in the simulator and developed the procedures that they could use the lunar module engine once it was powered up. So we developed the power up procedures and the burn procedures. And I don't remember how long that took, but certainly a few hours. And we got these written down. And so we came back over to Mission Control, and I got on the Capcom and read up all these procedures to Fred, as I recall. And they copied them down, and the time was, I don't remember the exact time of the burn. But the burn, they powered up the lunar module and executed this burn that got them back on free return, which was a big relief. But at this point, I was stunned, really. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and what I was seeing. And the thought of keep occurring to me, we got to really do something, because we got a spacecraft, lunar module. It was built for 2 guys for 3 days, and now we got 3 guys for 4 days. How are we going to make it last? And so once the free return was done, and I guess TK had Mattingly had figured out how to power down the command module, then it was a survival mode. How are we going to make it last? So that's what I recall. Are we going to have enough stuff? And sure enough, didn't look like it at first, but we got smarter and smarter, and so things did last.
So, Fred, working all those procedures, and using the lunar module to support the command module and get you guys home, how do you work through all that? How did it go? How did it transpire? What were your feelings as you were pulling all that together?
Well, we really didn't pull it together. As Charlie said, system people and a combination of astronauts, Charlie, our backup crew, and others. He mentioned Cernan. I think Ed Mitchell did some work too in the simulator. They kind of proofed and redlined and edited to make sure the procedure worked. And the lunar module simulator, things were just passed up to us to execute. That the use of the descent engine was not new. That had been done in test on Apollo 9 in Earth orbit. Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweikert did several maneuvers with the LEM hooked to the command module using that engine. So it wasn't like it had never been done before. But we did do it a little differently. Jim controlled, I think, manual throttle on that first burn, although attitude control, and that was controlled through automatically. We still had the computers up, computer, and so that was all an automated burn, as well as the next one after we went around the moon. So we had the advantage of still being able to use the computer to maintain attitude through those maneuvers.
So I got some questions from the folks here at KSC, and one of the things they want to know is, do you guys think it's going to be harder or easier to go back to the moon with the Artemis program than it was when we went with Apollo? What are your thoughts? Fred?
Well, I don't know enough about the vehicles and the systems and where they are. I know the landers got started a little late. Which is actually in several components. And of course, right now there's a critical things going on through the committees to see that it's funded properly to make the dates proposed. But there are a larger number of parts that have got to work, I think, in the Artemis plan. We had one big booster, the Saturn V, and 2 spacecraft that were singular, command module, command and service module, and the lunar module. And I think there's more parts involved, although obviously the world has learned to live with parts, as we've seen with the really the manufacturing and assembly of space station on orbit. So it's not like that's anything new too. But to me, it just adds another chance for if you don't have the ICDs, interface control documents, and everything right, to add a little more problem. As far as landing, I think it'll be the same, pretty much the same thing there. As far as finding a decent spot to land in, because there's rocks everywhere. Every mission, I think, had to deviate a little bit in its landing to find a good spot.
Charlie, as a moonwalker, what are your thoughts on this? Comparing Artemis, the complexity or the ease is going to be easier or harder?
Well, I don't know, like Fred, I don't know that much about the systems on Artemis, or the whatever we're going to call the lunar module. And I don't know the flight plan, but if I recall, I hear things like we're going to land near the South Pole. I think that probably may be a little bit more difficult. We've got our experience around the equator, but how long's the mission going to last? How long are they going to be on the surface? I don't know those details, and it it it, it could be a lot more difficult. I think the first time after not being there for 50 plus years, is going to be a real challenge, I think. But with training and picking the right landing site and knowing the systems and trusting everything, I think they'll pull it off okay. First landings are always tight, and if you can remember from Apollo 11. So we'll see.
All right. So, talking about the problems that came up on Apollo 13, when we head off to Mars, that's going to be a huge challenge with current propulsion technology. We're talking a year and a half, 2 years to get to Mars, land there, and come home when all the planets align to make everything work. And I'm sure they're going to have some problems along the way. What advice would you have to folks to be able to deal with problems, Fred, if something similar comes up, and with the time delays and everything else, huge challenge. So how do you train for that? How do you deal with that?
Well, you mentioned the time of the mission to go to Mars, and the reliability obviously will be a big concern. I think that you're going to need a skill on board that we hadn't necessarily had in a crew. You're going to need a person who can fix things, a good workaround, repair. That's a person in the crew that we didn't necessarily have before. I think there probably needs to be a little more attention to compatibility of the people that are on the crew that we did not have to. Obviously, the short missions we had in Apollo, you didn't have to worry about that. And although they have gone further on space station, up one person at least up to a year, and so I think compatibility of the crew will be another different kind of a consideration than we had in the Apollo days. But mainly a reliability of a system, because you're not going to have en route a handy Home Depot or Lowe's to go to. So you're going to have to live off of what you have on board. And even though solid state and electronics and whatever may be a little more reliable today, that's still a long time to worry about that.
Charlie, what advice would you give somebody if they ran into a similar problem on their way to Mars?
Well, I think you got to have a real good pre-flight planning and discuss every possibility. You're going to have a doctor on board if somebody gets really sick. and you're going to be prepared to do minor surgery and stuff like that. And like Fred says, you got to have a real good mechanic on board to uh, fix any systems. And then I think we found in the space station that a really good exercise program is necessary to keep you in good physical shape. If this Mars mission is a lander, then these guys and gals are going to have to be in really good shape when they get there. I think isolation might be a problem. You know, hello Houston, and 20 minutes later or whatever it is, you get a response back, and so you're independent, and we got to think about all of these medical problems that we might come up with and how we're going to handle them. Is there some sort of medical procedures that we can do before the crew goes? And how do we handle these certain problems to keep this thing going? Because once you have a real problem, if you had a problem like on 13, man, it'd take you a long time to get back. So it's going to be a major challenge, I think, taking people to the moon. I mean, to Mars. But if we get everybody geared up like we did in Apollo, and thorough planning and preparation, performance usually works out. So I'm optimistic about it, but it's going to be a real challenge.
Fredo, I got a question here from someone. They want to know how you kept your cool during Apollo 13. What did you do? What helped you remain calm so that you could get home safely?
Well, I think it was the training and background and experience. All of us of that day were military, had been military in our career, had flown high performance aircraft, had problems in airplanes along in our career. And so dealing with problems wasn't new in that sense. And we had confidence in the team and the process we had for handling problems. Every simulation we did with Mission Control, and we did many of them, what we call integrated sims, a special group in the background tried to formulate the failures they had available in the simulators to make, well, really, their hope was to make us and Mission Control look bad. But we were thoroughly tested that way through several thousand hours of simulation training to deal with failures, kind of business as usual. You mentioned the cool. It was interesting. I criticized some degree some of the drama in the Apollo 13 movie. Ron Howard told me he put that in because he listened to all the air-to-ground transmissions that NASA had given him. And he said, when I got done listening to that, he said, it never appeared to me you had a problem. So he said, I had to add some of that in there to sort of humanize you.
All right. So, Charlie, you kind of mentioned it in the beginning about the measles. So how did you end up exposing Ken Mattingly to the measles, and what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I caught, I think it was 10 days or so before the liftoff, and my 3-year-old caught the measles, and I caught the measles from him. So when I went to the dock down at by the time I broke out, I was at the Cape in training with everybody, and everybody was exposed. And so I went to the dock, and they said, well, you got the measles. And I was stunned. I mean, kids get the measles. And so, but I'd never had the measles. And so when they checked everybody, they found that Fredo had the measles, and John Young had the measles, Jack Swigert had the measles, and Jim Lovell had the measles, but Mattingly had not. So a big debate was going on, as I recall, about whether I wasn't involved in this debate because I was sick, homesick. Mattingly says he's not going to get the measles, but and to this day, as far as I know, he's never had the measles. But anyway, it was decided that they would exchange Mattingly, Schweikert for Mattingly, and they had a week. I guess y'all had about a week to get ready, Fredo. And as I remember, if if you all weren't ready, if you didn't think you were qualified, they were going to cancel. I mean, not qualified, but ready as a crew, you were going to scrub the mission for a month. But everything worked out okay, and they were. Mattingly came back on our crew, and Jack Schweikert took his place. And I remember I went home and was recovering from the measles. And when the accident occurred, I was well enough to run into mission control. Let me add a comment about what Fred said when he saw, when he was in his seat and he looked at the oxygen tanks and he saw the problem and he was really sick to his stomach. I had that same feeling. I don't know whether you remember or not, but on the backside of the moon, we were 1 hour before starting our descent. When Mattingly says there's something wrong with his engine, the main engine, he had to change his orbit from a 60/8 to a 60 circular and use the main engine. Well, one of the control systems on that engine was out. Well, that's an abort. And you can imagine, I don't know whether your heart can sink to the bottom of your boots at zero gravity or not, but let me tell you, I had that same feeling as Fredo. We are doomed. We can't make a landing. And you can imagine circling the moon, and there is your landing site 8 miles beneath you. And you got a good spacecraft, and mission control's about to tell you to come home. But fortunately, let me say it again, the unsung heroes of Apollo mission control, excuse me, saved the day. And they did it in 15, they did in 11, they did in 16. So that kind of help from mission control is going to continue to be really important for a moon mission, I think, like Artemis. So this integration and the training of both mission control and the crew and all the support is very, very important.
Fredo, when Schweikert replaced Mattingly, what impact did that have on your crew? How did you feel about that? How did that work out?
Well, it was a very emotional thing, frankly, rather than a technical concern about Jack being able to do the job versus TK. I knew he would be behind TK on some of the orbital things that he would have to do, replacing Ken while we were on the surface, because that was going on with TK and Farouk Albaz up to the 11th hour with changes and new things. And I knew Jack wouldn't be quite up to speed with that kind of stuff. But as far as the basic launch and working the lunar orbit and out and entries, I didn't feel there was any concern that Jack could perform his job in the position of CMP. We trained pretty much equally with the prime crew throughout Apollo. I certainly felt on any mission, I was a backup. I was a backup on 8, and to Bill Anders, I backed up Buzz Aldrin on 11. And I certainly felt I could have flown the mission on either of those. And really the week of launch as we had to do. So it wasn't a technical safety concern to me. It was very emotional because obviously, similarly, Ken had worked hard through the backup on 11 to get to this point, and now at the 11th hour to be yanked was just horrible. Because by that time, Jack had mentally sort of pulled away and said, "Well, I'm not going to get to. I've done the work, but I'm not going to get to fly." So it was a real flip flop that way. And of course, on a more personal note, Ken had lots of friends and family coming to see him launch. And of course, so we now watch a different guy launch. And similar to PPKs, we're allowed to carry a personal preference kit with items that I've spent several months canvassing family and friends on what small items I might carry. And Ken had done a similar thing and had his packed on board. And of course, Jack didn't have time to do that for things he might have wanted to take on the mission. So that was the main difference in doing a crew change that late.
So, Fred, is it true that the oxygen tank that had a problem on your mission was originally on the Apollo 11 SM?
No, actually, it was Apollo 10's tank. At one
Apollo
point,
10's tank, yeah.
Yeah, they had found EMI problem, and they took the tanks out of all the vehicles and shipped them back to Boulder, Colorado. Beach company had made the tanks, and they changed out all the tank components, and I think did some insulation or rewiring. And Apollo 10's tank, when they removed it at Downey, they had not completely undone one bolt or nut or something, and it fell a short distance as they were trying to get it off out of that bay. Not very far, about a foot, I was told. But they think that jarring moved the standpipe within the tank that was normally used at Kennedy to flow gaseous nitrogen through to support detanking it. In other words, it's a very good thermos bottle, those tanks. And when they fill with oxygen, it takes a long time for it to decay normally. So they would normally run nitrogen through it, room temperature, and that would help boil off the oxygen when we did the wet countdown a couple of weeks before launch. So the problem was set up that way, but it was Apollo 10's tank that we inherited when they reshuffled the tanks back into the system.
So I kind of bet you wish Tom Stafford would have had that tank instead of you.
Jim Lovell reminds him of that every time they get together.
So when you undock the command module from the service module to re-enter, and you got to look at what it looked like from the outside, what were your thoughts when you saw that?
Well, I was frankly amazed looking at the extent of the damaged area that the explosion had not seemed more severe. As I said, we had a loud bang that kind of reverberated through the metal hull, and a small, not erratic motion, some little slight motion, and jets, reaction jets firing, attitude jets. But looking at that damage, I would have expected to have a much bigger impulse than we felt. Fortunately, that it didn't work inward. Rather, that the outside covering of quarter of the spacecraft sheared the bolts and let it loose. The pressure built up. So it didn't work inward to the propellant tanks because we had not used the SPS big engine on the service module but once. So we had a full set of tanks of hypergolics. That was good. It didn't mess with them.
You guys were pretty lucky. Charlie, we can't let you go without asking, what was it like to walk on the moon?
Well, it was certainly exciting. awesome, excitement, wonder, awe. You just had this, I'm on the moon, and John and I never lost that excitement and wonder of being on the moon. You were always looking forward to what's the next stop going to show, what's our next experiment, and what we're going to see over that next ridge. And as Buzz said, it was magnificent desolation, and that's the way I would describe it. It was, but you felt right at home because you'd studied the landing site photographs so thoroughly, and you knew your path and where you wanted to go, and you could see the major landmarks. Like on to our south, we had Stone Mountain, which was maybe 4 miles away, and that was our objective, almost to the top of that, one on the second EVA. Navigating across the moon is with photographs that you have of only 40 feet resolution. There are a lot of things less than 40 feet up there that if you go over a little rise and there's a crater and you didn't know it was on your maps, you had to be really careful. We had a ball. It was really exciting. I never lost my excitement or enthusiasm about what we were going to see and what we we're going to do and how we we're going to respond. As I said, I felt right at home because of recognizing these major landmarks. And so North Ray Crater we could see, South Ray Crater, which was too far away. We started seeing rocks and picking up rocks that were unusual as far as the geologists said. They thought we had two volcanic flows up there meeting in the Cayley Plains, but there was no big volcanics there. So our rocks were unique to the highlands, and so it was very exciting to stay there. And since we were 6 hours late landing, we cut the last EVA short by a couple of hours. And we pleaded with Mission Control to let us stay and come on, guys, give us another 2 hours. And they said, get back inside. And so we lost out the last couple of hours. But basically, we wanted to stay another day. It was so exciting. But of course, you come home according to the flight plan, and that was it. So it was a wonder, excitement, just tremendous time. Always something exciting, looking forward to.
Fredo, if you had to pick one thing, what was the major lesson learned from Apollo 13, in your opinion?
Well, I don't know that there was a lesson learned. Obviously, you could go into the accident board and the report and the findings. I think Apollo 13 mainly served, and both through the movie and the real-time story of making the world aware of the process and the system we had in place and the talent of the team. And I'm talking even beyond Mission Control. Some people, the total team that somehow got involved, maybe just on telecons or whatever. The brain trust was incredible. And I think it's like any program like that, anything that has a great challenge will tend to draw good people, and they'll be obviously highly motivated. Many people I know, talking to them after the flight, got less sleep on the ground than I got in flight, even as miserable as the conditions got. So I think it serves a good story that way of the what you can do with the right people, the right talent, and teamwork to pull off some things that appear to maybe be mission impossible.
All right, so now I got a question for both of you, and I'll start with Fred. Fred, you were a pilot in the Marine Corps, a research pilot up at what was then the Lewis Research Center. What led you to be an astronaut? What made you apply for the astronaut program?
Uh, well, it was a difficult decision, actually. I left Lewis and I followed Neil's trail. Neil started at Lewis, Neil Armstrong, and Neil went to Edwards, and then he went in the astronaut program. And I was about 2.5 years behind Neil on that same trail. And once Neil visited back at Flight Research Center after he was in the program, and Don Malik, and I asked him what was it like being an astronaut. It was kind of a strange answer. Neil said with a slow sort of drawl, not a South Carolina drawl, but speaking slowly, said, "Well," he said, "you sit in a lot of meetings. You sit in a simulator a lot of hours, and you don't get much good flying." And of course, he was comparing it to being involved the way we were at the Flight Research Center, where we'd be flying a number of different types of aircraft, participating in maybe 3 test programs at the same time. And so I really had a question in my mind: do I want to leave having all this fun? But the key thing was the thought of going to the moon. I realized if I stayed at Edwards, I was not going to have that opportunity. So it's simply that point, that if I stay here, I'm not going to get to go to the moon, so I applied.
Awesome. Charlie, a 1957 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, and you chose a commission in the Air Force, became a pilot in the Air Force. What led you to be an astronaut?
Well, I fell in love with airplanes at the Naval Academy, and so back then, as you know, as you just said, there was no Air Force Academy, so you could volunteer for either Air Force or naval aviation. And the doctor, my first class year, told me, "Mr. Maduke, you have an astigmatism in your right eye, and you don't qualify for naval aviation, but the Air Force will take you." So I went in the Air Force and became a fighter interceptor pilot in 1959, went to Germany. Well, and by the way, I just soloed at Spence Air Base in South Georgia in October '57, when on the 4th of October, Sputnik went up. And that was the beginning of the space age, in my opinion, and or my mind. And so when I got to Germany, NASA had been formed, and the first group of astronauts. And but I didn't think I was excited about the space program, but I wasn't even near qualified, and I was having a great job like Fredo. We were flying every day and sitting alert, and we were fighter interceptor squadron, and so we were scrambled a lot to go intercept unidentified whoever's. And so in my last year there, '62, the Air Force wanted me to go to back to graduate school and get a master's degree, and I got to MIT. And that was a real important decision for me. I look back now. I could have extended a year in Ramstein, Germany, and flew for another year, which was really exciting. Or I could leave that exciting job and go to MIT. If I'd have stayed another year at Ramstein and then gone to MIT, I never would have been selected as an astronaut. So I made the right decision and went back to MIT. And while I was there, my thesis, I had to figure out something to write a master's thesis on. And my advisor said, "Well, why don't you go to the instrumentation lab? They're working on the Apollo guidance and navigation system." And so I went over there and started working on that system, which MIT had the contract to build. And while I was working over there, a lot of and I can't say a lot of the astronauts, but several of the second and third group came up to look at this system. And I'd never met anybody so excited about their job as these guys. And well, how did I get that job? And they said, well, go to test pilot school when you get your degree and maybe you'll have a chance. So when I graduated, reported right into test pilot school in the summer of 64, graduated in 65 that summer. And 2 months later, NASA had a call for astronauts, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. The moon was a real lure, and I didn't think we'd get a chance because we were the bottom of the totem pole. We were the rookies, but just fortuitously, Fredo and I and a lot of the original 19, our fifth group, got to go to the moon. And so it turned out to be a good decision for me to go back to MIT and get my master's degree.
Excellent. So, Fred, you talked about your love of test flying and engineering. After Apollo, you didn't fly another Apollo mission. You would have, but the program got canceled. What was in store for you after Apollo 13?
Well, after Apollo 13, I served another backup, worked with Charlie on Apollo 16. I was John Young's backup commander on 16. I had in mind long term then, thinking about what I might do when maybe I got beyond flying. I wanted to get into program management, so I talked to Chris at the time, and so he arranged, and I got off to PMD course at Harvard Business School, and came back and went to work for Aaron Cohen in the Orbiter project office. And I think Charlie at the same time was upstairs in the next level and working for Don Cheatham, also in the program office in the early development of shuttle. And I was 4 years in working for Aaron in that office. I was a regular member of the engineering change board. I actually was on the group that evaluated the proposals to choose who would build shuttle out of the four competitors, which turned out to be Rockwell. And spent a lot of time more on the program management side at all the program reviews, visiting contractors, subcontractors, while shuttle was getting designed and developed and manufactured. And then was blessed to be chosen as one of four people, myself and Gordon Fullerton and one crew, Joe Engle and Dick Truly, in the second crew to fly the very first Space Shuttle Enterprise in what I'd call an aircraft test program. We were going to fly the orbiter on top of a 747, using it as our launch vehicle through this really fairly short test program, which turned out to be highly successful. Ahead of the other work going on, the more major work going on in the program, ready in Columbia to do the first orbital flights. So that was another good time for me back to Edwards, back to flight test kind of business. And then to have the privilege and honor of making the first flight of an orbiter, Enterprise, in August of 1977.
So, Charlie and Fred, we got a challenging future in front of us. I think it's an outstanding future as we work with our international and commercial partners to get us back to the moon and eventually onto Mars. What advice do you have for the NASA team as we move forward, Fred?
Well, I think that obviously, the normal programmatics you deal with, and at a certain level, very important, obviously, is the people that have to interface with congressional committees, subcommittees, up to the major committees, to appropriations, because none of these programs will succeed and or be on schedule unless they're adequately funded per a program plan. And unfortunately, through NASA's career to this point, Apollo was really the only program that I've seen that has been, call it, adequately funded, fully funded per the plan laid out. In fact, with a reasonable reserve. We had some struggle in early shuttle, in fact, even with funding. And of course, space station, I went off after I left NASA with Grumman Corporation. We won a contract for the Space Station Freedom system engineering development that I led in Washington, and that was a real struggle for budgeting during that 4 years on Space Station Freedom, which eventually did come together and has become the ISS of today. But no, the system engineering approach is a good approach that obviously they'll use. I think the people will be geared with the mission. The mission is defined in Artemis, and people will get excited and motivated and be willing to put in the time and the hours and the effort it takes to get the job done.
Charlie, what advice do you have for the NASA team as we go exploring?
Well, like Fred, I think it's going to be very important that the budget stay up with the plan, and it's extremely important that I think everybody stay focused on their project or on their part of it, and that we do very thorough planning, and then prepare for the plan, and hopefully then the performance will come out. I see Artemis as a big motivator. I think we're going to have that motivation for Artemis like we had in Apollo, and funding will be critical. And if we have an ample budget, I'm very optimistic about it. And I think the NASA culture, the way we build teamwork, the way we train and plan and prepare is going to give us a successful mission, and more than one. And so we'll see how it all goes. We're pulling for you. And I don't know about, people ask me, would you go to the moon again? Yeah, but I don't think be 85 tomorrow. And I don't think I'm not expecting a call from NASA to come start training. But we'll be there for liftoff, I'll tell you.
Well, I'd go in a heartbeat. So one more question. There's a lot of, you mentioned going to the moon and how exciting it is. And there's a lot of young folks out there that, they're part of the Artemis generation. They are going to be part of the, next man, first woman on the moon. And as we go forward and on to Mars, what's your advice to our young engineers, to the young folks out there that want to be an astronaut? Fred?
Well, I start even younger. I try to, first of all, assure young people, I talk to a lot of them down to K through 12, to recognize the talent they have and to try to get geared in the right direction. As you said, some have, they're figured out they're good with math and science, and so they'll end up with an engineering or a science degree. Obviously, to get into the astronaut program, requires at least a certain level of experience that you can put in, quote, a resume. They used to require, I assume they still do, certain reference people that have observed you, maybe even teachers, along the way that can add to your resume as far as your qualifications, your capability to do the job, to get a job done against a goal that's set. Those sorts of things that are key. And joining a program with the pressure of schedules and the time required and the motivation to stick with it to get the job done. I know that was a big surprise to me from leaving the flight test business at Edwards, which was, I won't say was casual, but it was certainly more a normal day job, to get into the Bavalo program, which was like another war in terms of the schedule pressure and the work effort required to get the job done. So I think that's what the people, the kind of people that we need, and have that interest and dedication.
Charlie, your turn.
Well, I think to motivate these young people in STEM courses is really important. I'm involved with a couple of organizations that do that, and I see a lot of interest in space returning in among the young people. So I just tell them, if you really want to do this, then you're going to have to dedicate yourself to hard work, to stay focused, take the right courses, learn to sort of to maneuver around. If you're in one course but you don't like to be a physicist, maybe another way to go and do something you like. I would recommend to the young people to take courses that you like and that you're really enthusiastic about, and get your degree in those fields. And if the space program is still there when you graduate, then you got a chance. But to take physics when you hate physics and you should be a medical doctor, just because you want to be an astronaut and to get your physics degree, and the space program's canceled, and what are you going to do now? So follow your heart and stay focused on your career. And if you end up where you want to volunteer, I think the opportunity's going to be there. And as Fred said, you got to have a really thick resume today, and a strong resume to get selected. But I tell a lot of people there's a lot of jobs that you're not going to fly, but NASA's an exciting place to work, and with all of the different programs that are underway, and you can find your niche and work hard, stay focused.
Excellent advice from both of you. Gentlemen, it has been a real pleasure and an honor. Charlie, happy birthday tomorrow. Give my best to Dottie. Fred, Maureen, it's always a pleasure talking with you. You guys are both my heroes, and I just wish you all the very best. Thank you for all that you've done for America's space program. I want you to know that the NASA team is as good as it's ever been, and we're going to continue to charge into the future. We're going to make Artemis successful. We're going to get back to the moon, and we're going to go on to Mars, because that's what we need to do. And I appreciate all your support. Thanks much, guys.
Thanks,
Take
Bob.
care.